My name is Evelyn Hankins, and I'm a curator here at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. And with me today is Jennie C. Jones, a Brooklyn-based artist whose work is currently featured in our Direction show titled Jennie C. Jones, Higher Resonance. The project is a site-specific immersive installation that features paintings, sculptures, works on paper, and a two-part sound work. Together, these works highlight unexplored confluences between modernist abstraction and African-American experimental music, including jazz. Welcome, Jennie.
Hi.
Hi. Your work brings together sound or music with more conventional media. Could you talk a little bit about your background and how you came to work with sound?
I've told the story before, so I hope it's not boring to hear it again, but I spent a lot of time curating the music I was listening to in my studio while I was working. And I first had to sort of grapple with coming out as a conceptual artist and realizing that some of my struggles in terms of looking for content were present in the room the whole time. It was part of the process of listening and the process of curating the music that was going to be and work in tandem with my practice.
Why was it hard to come to terms with being a conceptual artist?
I think that art school kind of, well, I don't want to blame art school, but I think it's scary when you start to leave object making behind and you start to think about your work more in terms of ideas and not product and not what's going to be in the white box gallery. So then you have to go backwards and sort of bridge those two worlds. And that's how sound circled back to using unconventional materials and soundproofing materials.
And you've often used the phrase listening as a conceptual practice to really frame your work. Could you talk a little bit about that phrase?
Well, I do feel like exactly what I was just talking about in terms of studio time, that the methodology that leads towards editing a sound piece is really grounded in doing a lot of listening, and listening in a different kind of way than just for pure pleasure or just for grooving. There's also historic connections that I'm making, or moments where I know there'll be sort of a connection either through contrast or counterpoint between two very different types of music, although they were happening at the same historic juncture. So moments like that, wrapping those together, I think is a part of like what I call listening as a conceptual practice.
But you still describe yourself as an artist, not a composer, and you talk about your sound works as audio collages and not musical compositions. Can you talk about the distinction?
Well, I think it's a little bit different than like a DJ practice, which is straightforward in the sense of how a DJ deals with time in a linear way. I think once you start getting into having more than two tracks and start layering things and start making decisions that are really grounded in intention in a different way than a DJ practice, that it starts to become more about audio collage. It starts to become more about depth and sound operating on this layered horizontal versus a very straight linear path.
And the Hirshhorn Museum, as you know, is in a very unusual location for a contemporary art museum. It's here on the National Mall. We have very diverse audiences, and we're free and open to the public. A lot of your work, both in terms of its minimalist visual sources and its musical source materials, aren't necessarily recognizable to our visitors. How do you feel about that, and what are you kind of hoping that the visitors get out of coming into your site-specific installation?
Well, I think hopefully it has many entry points. Hopefully you don't have to have a full knowledge of art history or the history of minimalism or jazz history to just have an immersive experience and to just be present in a room that is connecting a visual experience with an audible experience. I hope that it works on all these levels, and then if you do make a reference that, like you did in the essay, to a Barnett Newman, or you look at the source material for the sound pieces and you discover someone that you didn't know, and you start listening to Ollie Wilson, or you start listening to Cecil Taylor, or some little snippet that I've taken and reframed, that's a part of the work too.
And one of the things I love that you've spoken about, especially in your conversation with Jason Moran, is how thrilled you were to be next door to Ellsworth Kelly. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to be at the Hirshhorn because, as someone who, for lack of a better term, would say I'm really into like neo-modernism, which is like thinking about modernism through the filter of postmodernism. I think that being with Ellsworth Kelly on one side of the gallery and Clifford Still on the other, it feels pretty special. It feels pretty special to be in conversation with history in that way when a lot of my work is in conversation with history.
Right, and one of the things we've talked about also is how the music spills out into the other spaces, and on some level Ellsworth Kelly is forced to deal with you because the sound is coming out. As someone said to me so beautifully, it calls to you when you come out up the escalator and hear the piece. As I said, your piece here was a site-specific project, which means that in part it responds to the unique architecture or the given conditions of the space. Could you talk a little bit about your first site visit here when we brought you here and we showed you, you had many different options where you could have the show, but we decided upon what is traditionally called the Directions Gallery, which for people who haven't been here is situated right in the middle of the permanent collection on the third floor. Could you talk about the visit and how that shaped how the show came about and how it ultimately looks?
Well, of course, because the Hirshhorn has a unique structure, a round structure, and the Kelly room, as you mentioned when I first visited, has the only straight wall in the gallery. That immediately called to mind looking at floor plans and plans of amphitheaters and just acoustically how much a curved wall leans towards better and stronger acoustics. And so without getting too deeply into educating myself architecturally or with physics, we decided to go with a curved wall. And I think that building a curved wall in response to the architecture of the building was a linchpin for moving forward with the project and helping me sort of solidify how the two-dimensional work was going to be in that space as well. I mean, we talked about doing something outside or other parts of the museum, but in the end, I really like feeling challenged by how you can manipulate a white box. And instead of walking into a gallery situation where you have to contend with the room and deal with how the sound is going to be in that room as it is, this was the first opportunity to actually be able to shape the room and the architecture around the fact that there was going to be sound in it.
Right, and as you said,
successfully or not.
Quite successfully, I think. The key element to the show right now, I think, or the thing you first see when you come into the gallery is this very large curved wall, and it does two things. It creates a distinctive listening space and then a peripheral space. It also creates a more kind of, I would say, modestly scaled architectural setting, which is appropriate for the size of your work. But that idea about an inside space and an outside space, a periphery, is really important for your work. And could you talk about that, how that operates on so many different levels in your work and how it operates here as well?
Well, when we were doing the talk with Jason Moran, I was trying to sort of figure out some way to string together all these different ideas, and also just having the privilege of sitting down with Jason, I don't really get to talk to a lot of musicians or be in conversation with them. So looking at the source material and a lot of the composers and musicians I was pointing at through the sound piece have operated on the periphery. We're never sort of mainstream artists. And I think periphery is very different from saying someone is marginalized or saying that they're on the margin. For me, when you talk about the periphery or interior, exterior, it's kind of like the canon being in the center of the dialogue or choosing to operate outside, choosing to operate on the periphery as a rebellious act, which a lot of jazz did, a lot of music did of that time period. So the periphery then folds and makes this metaphor that happens to work quite well with the interior exterior of the gallery space itself, like feeling like you're on the outside of the wall and then coming into this other conversation on the inside of the installation.
Right, and one of the things we talked about as we were planning the show together is whether something would go on the exterior of the wall, and I love sitting in the ambulatory and kind of watching our visitors go through, and they walk by the gallery and they'll see nothing on that wall because it's a blank space, and that immediately upends the traditional hierarchy about the visual arts in a museum space, and it's what happens, I've seen, is that the music calls to them and then they take the time to go in and take a look at the project. One of the things that has been striking me since I've known you now about a year and a half, when we first did our first studio visit in your apartment, actually, you said to me, what does it mean for an African-American woman to be making abstractions? Representation for many artists and for several generations of artists really was seen as the way to kind of deal with themes of identity. But I think you're of a generation of artists who doesn't necessarily feel like that's the only way you can deal with issues of identity. Can you talk about how abstraction and your identity kind of come together or how they work together and what that statement means to you now?
Well, I think it is hard. I think it's challenging, and it's taken a long time. I mean, I started working in a minimalist way a couple years ago, and probably thinking about it, but being afraid of it, probably more than 10 years ago. And just like with music and learning about avant-garde music that was produced by African Americans, there was my precedent. So that was another reason why I started paying more attention to sound and music history and folding that in, because it was the precedent that I was sort of looking for, the permission, if you will, that I was looking for to pull in and feel like comfortable with the aesthetic that was mine. It's still a slow burn. It's a slow process.
Do you ever feel under criticism for working in abstraction?
Yes and no. I think maybe 10 years ago even it would have been a different conversation. I think that like post-multicultural discourse, it's like things got really hot and then they sort of re-solidified. There's just way too many colleagues and peers that are not even asking for permission at all.
It's just a given now.
That it's just, I think there's space for all voices now. And I think that but that's finally a good thing. That essentialism in terms of what African American artists produce is finally coming to a close.
Right, what they're allowed to produce and what they're expected to produce. One final question. What surprised you most about the Hirshhorn project and the way it turned out?
How fun it was. No, really, it was just like everyone was really amazing here, and we have a new friendship.
I know we do. That's a great thing. I think that's a good way to end this. So
Yeah.
thank you, Jenny, for
You're
taking the time to talk
welcome.
with us today, and thank you.